She was still standing at the altar. Same dress, same veil, same bouquet of white roses. 11 years had passed. She hadn't aged a single day, and her head was still bowed. But I could feel her eyes on me. Welcome, creepy souls. Tonight we're stepping inside an abandoned church, a place where one man's worst mistake became something that refuses to let him go. This is a story about love, guilt, and whatever it is that's been waiting in the dark ever since. He ran from that church 11 years ago. He thought it was over. He thought she had moved on. But 4 months ago, he came back to that town, and what he found standing at that altar shouldn't have been possible. And what was waiting for him at home that night was even worse. Turn off the lights, and let's dive in. People always ask me why I never remarried. I tell them the same thing every time, that I'm just not ready. That after everything that happened with Claire, my heart needs more time. They nod, they understand, they stop pushing. It's a clean answer, a believable answer. It's also a lie. The truth is something I've spent 11 years trying to convince myself wasn't real, something I locked behind 3 bottles of whiskey and 2 therapists who both eventually suggested I was suffering from complicated grief. Maybe they were right. I used to hope they were right. But then I went back to St. Dominic's, and now I know they weren't. Let me start from the beginning, because that's the only way any of this makes sense. Claire and I met in college. She was the kind of woman who filled every room she walked into. Not loudly, not with drama, but with this quiet, warm gravity that pulled everyone toward her. She laughed with her whole body. She remembered your coffee order after one conversation. She made you feel like you were the most interesting person alive. We were engaged for 2 years, planned every detail of that wedding like it was a military operation. The flowers, the seating chart, the playlist for the reception. White roses, 64 guests, a small church on the edge of town called St. Dominic's, which Claire had loved since she was a little girl because, as she put it, it smells like old wood and honesty. She wasn't wrong. That church smelled like history, like oak pews that had absorbed a century of grief and joy, like extinguished candles and stone that never fully dried, even in summer. The moment you stepped inside, you felt the weight of every prayer that had ever been spoken there sitting heavy in the air. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in October. I was late, not fashionably late, not 5 minutes late. I was 47 minutes late because my best man, Derek, had mixed up the start times and we'd sat in a diner 3 miles away like idiots for the better part of an hour. Laughing about nothing, completely unaware. By the time we arrived at the church, the parking lot was empty. I remember thinking it was strange, that specific, crawling kind of strange that sits at the back of your skull before your brain catches up to your gut. It was 2 in the afternoon. There should have been 64 cars. There were none. Inside the church was silent. The roses were arranged beautifully along the aisle. The candles were still lit. The programs were still stacked neatly at the entrance. And every single pew was empty. Claire was gone. The guests were gone. Her parents, who I'd planned to see standing at the front row, beaming, gone. I found out later that the guests had waited 30 minutes before Claire's mother made the call. Claire had been composed, apparently. That was what everyone said. She was composed. She thanked the guests for coming. She asked them to leave. She wouldn't let anyone see her cry. She walked out a side door and never looked back. I tried to reach her. She changed her number, moved, disappeared into a new life, the way only truly devastated people do, completely, surgically, without a trace. I moved away myself eventually. Different city, different job, different version of a life I hadn't chosen. I learned to sleep again, learned to stop checking her old social media, learned to breathe through October like it was a normal month. 11 years passed. I was in town for my mother's 80th birthday. 1 weekend, 2 nights, nothing more. I don't know what made me drive past St. Dominic's. Muscle memory, maybe. Old roads have a way of pulling your hands before your mind catches up, but I found myself in that parking lot on a Friday evening, engine idling, staring at those heavy oak doors. The church had been closed for years. The diocese had decommissioned it in 2019. Lack of congregation, structural concerns, something about the foundation. A notice on the gate said as much in faded text. Still, there was light inside, just barely. Just a thin, warm glow bleeding through the stained glass on the left side, the side where the altar was, the kind of candle light that flickers. I told myself it was vandals, kids probably, curious teenagers who'd pried open a door and were lighting candles for atmosphere, daring each other to spend 5 minutes in the dark. I told myself to drive away. I got out of the car instead. The side door, the same one Claire had walked out of 11 years ago, was open, not forced, not broken. just open, resting gently against the stone frame like someone had meant to come back and close it. The smell hit me first. White roses. Impossible, overpowering, and completely wrong for a building that had been empty for years. That thick, sweet, almost medicinal smell of fresh white roses mixed with something underneath it, something older, something that reminded me of a refrigerator that had been unplugged too long. I stepped inside. The candles on the altar were lit, all of them, a dozen small flames throwing their yellow light across stone walls covered in years of dust, across pews that hadn't been sat in for half a decade. And at the altar, facing away from me, stood a woman in a white dress. My first thought was calm, rational, embarrassingly simple. Wrong church, wrong bride, wrong night. A bride who'd wandered into an abandoned building for photographs. Or a woman in a costume, or... My brain was working so hard to find any explanation. A mannequin someone had placed there as a prank. I stood at the back of the aisle and waited for her to move. She didn't. I waited a full minute, maybe longer. The candles didn't flicker. The air didn't move. She stood with her hands at her sides, head slightly bowed, veil trailing down her back. The dress was, and I remember this with horrible clarity, the dress was ivory, tea-length, with lace along the sleeves. It was the dress Claire had picked out, the exact dress. My heart stopped working properly around then. It became something less like a heartbeat and more like a fist slamming against a wall. Irregular, panicked, wet. I could feel my pulse in my temples, in my jaw, in my fingertips. I should have left. Every single nerve in my body was issuing the same instruction. Turn around, walk out, don't look, don't speak, leave. I walked down the aisle. Claire? My voice came out smaller than I intended, thin and dry, like a sound from the bottom of a very deep well. She didn't turn. I was 15 feet away, then 10, then close enough to see that the veil was yellowed at the edges, not old-fashioned, not vintage intentional, but aged, like something that had been sitting in a room for 11 years. The lace on her sleeves had gone brittle. The hem of the dress was gray with dust. But the flowers she was holding, a bouquet of white roses, clasped in both hands in front of her, were fresh, perfectly, obscenely fresh. Claire, 5 feet now. I could hear the candles, that tiny, almost silent sound of flame consuming wick. I could smell the roses and beneath them, that other smell, growing stronger now. And my brain finally named it the way you name something you've been trying not to. Decay, sweet and cold and wrong. She turned. I don't know how to write what her face looked like without making it sound like a film, like something designed to be frightening. But horror isn't always designed. Sometimes it's just wrong. The wrongness of a face that is recognizable and beloved, and also somehow deeply, fundamentally impossible. It was Claire's face at 31 years old, not aged, not changed, not touched by a single year of the 11 that had passed. The same dark eyes, the same small mouth, the same bone structure I had once memorized the way you memorize something you're terrified of losing. She was looking at me, except her head was still bowed. Her head had not moved. The veil still hung forward over her face, undisturbed. And yet I felt her eyes on me with a physical certainty, the way you feel a hand on your shoulder in the dark. The hairs on my arms were standing up. The air behind me felt suddenly, horrifically occupied. Warm breath touching the back of my neck. A presence so close I could feel the displacement of air, and I understood without turning around that whatever Claire had become was not only in front of me. I ran. I don't remember crossing the aisle. I remember the side door slamming behind me, the cold night air on my face, my knees hitting the gravel of the parking lot. I remember driving away so fast I ran a red light 3 blocks from the church and sat shaking at the next intersection for 4 minutes before I trusted my hands on the wheel. I never went back. I've never told anyone the whole story until now. Not my mother, not my therapist, not the one friend who knew Claire well enough to understand. What would I say? That a dead woman was waiting for me at the altar? Claire isn't dead. I looked her up when I got home that night. She's alive. Married, actually. Somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. 2 kids. A life that looks warm and full from the outside. So, what was it I saw? I've asked myself that question every night for the past 4 months. And I've almost found a way to live with the uncertainty. With the possibility that grief does strange things to a man's mind. That an empty church and a dusty mannequin and too much emotional history can produce a very convincing hallucination. Almost. Except that last night, getting up for water at 3 a.m., I passed the mirror in my hallway and I stopped, because hanging on the hook beside my front door, the hook where I keep my keys and nothing else, and I live alone, was a small bouquet of white roses, fresh ones, still cold, like they'd just come in from the night air. And from somewhere in the apartment behind me, too far away to be the street, too close to be anything other than inside these walls. I heard the soft, patient sound of fabric brushing against hardwood floor, like the hem of a dress trailing through the dark. Waiting. If you've ever felt like something followed you home, you might already know how this ends. Stay safe out there. And if you're getting married soon, make sure you're on time. He never found those roses in the morning light. He told himself they weren't real. Most of us do that. We tell ourselves it wasn't real, right up until it happens again. If tonight's story stayed with you, drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever been somewhere that felt like something was already waiting for you? I read every single one, and if you made it this far, you already know you belong here.